The bill for establishing religious freedom passed Virginia's General Assembly in 1786 and became the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom.
Pond 5.
This political achievement marked in Virginia the legal protection of liberty of conscience as an inherent right, not as a bestowal of toleration from the state. From Constantine to Queen Elizabeth, and from Queen Elizabeth to colonial Virginia, leaders, ecclesiastic, and state assumed religious uniformity from the top to the bottom of the population, provided the necessary stability for the maintenance of a peaceful society. This was taken for granted, and it was culturally fortified that forced conformity to the state church. Virginia's Statute for Religious Freedom overturned this assumption and redirected the Western world's relationship between church and state. Over 200 years later, it is easy to assume the development of religious freedom in these terms was inevitable, but at a time when established state religion and forced conformity was the norm in Virginia, it was an extraordinary event, reliant on the choices and actions of local citizens and skilled statesmen. How did it pass? The 1786 defeat of Patrick Henry's General Assessment Bill in Virginia legislature led to the passage of a bill Thomas Jefferson wrote 7 years prior, called the Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom. Jefferson presented this bill in 1779 as part of an effort to revise the Virginia legal code. He was tasked with updating the code after Virginia signed the Declaration of Independence and changed its government from a colony to a new state. Jefferson's bill would disestablish the state church and permit individuals to believe and to worship as they chose, without government involvement. Jefferson presented his radical bill to the Virginia legislature soon after he wrote it, but the Assembly barely addressed it. The power of the established church was too strong, and the members postponed the reading of the bill for a day when the legislative session had already closed. What changed in 1786 to finally pass it? The Revolutionary War ushered in change that emboldened dissenters to reject traditional deference to elites and petition for legal equality. Dissenters were people who chose to believe and worship outside of the Anglican Church, the established Church of Virginia. As these people bore the hardships of the war and shouldered significant responsibility for the support of an infant government, many of this inferior sort thought of themselves as equal to the gentry and sought the legal protection of their right of conscience. Then Patrick Henry proposed a general assessment bill, which would require a tax to support instruction by Christian teachers of varied denominations. It ignited the first truly popular state political campaign. In protest of Henry's general assessment, James Madison anonymously penned the now quintessential document on American religious liberty, Memorial and Remonstrance, which defined religious liberty as an inherent right outside the reach of the state. This document influenced the way dissenters articulated their grievances and petitions, and likely sparked interest in organizing a petition campaign. While Madison was influential, to be sure, it was the dissenters who who sent an avalanche of petitions for the November 1785 legislative session that killed the General Assessment Bill and generated the momentum for Madison to reintroduce to the General Assembly Jefferson's Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom. Jefferson was in France, so Madison resurrected the bill at the timely moment. Thomas Jefferson's Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom passed because of James Madison's savvy political maneuvering, but he was only one man, an important man, but laws in the United States do not pass because of one voice. The diverse voices expressed in dissenter petitions opposing the general assessment overwhelmed the Assembly and created the circumstances to defeat Patrick Henry's bill and bring about the protection of the inherent right of conscience in Virginia.
Pond 5.
The established church in Virginia was powerful before the American Revolution. The colony inherited from England a long tradition of forced conformity to the state religion, reaching back to 312 AD, when Constantine imposed Christianity on his subjects. In England, it was the monarch's responsibility to provide for the spiritual care of the people. The state religion was the exclusive source for salvation, so laws criminalized nonconformity to this sole source of truth. Henry VIII's separation from the Church of Rome created religious upheaval in England. After his death, the king's daughter, Mary, tried to reinstate England as Catholic. She horrified her subjects by murdering Protestant leaders and followers in an effort to purify the church. When Mary's half-sister Elizabeth assumed the throne, she used religion to achieve political stability. Under Elizabeth's direction, Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity in 1558, which required every English subject to attend Anglican church once a week or be fined. It also revised the Book of Common Prayer. This settled England as Anglican. The Elizabethan Compromise became an integral part of British political structure. Virginia colonists patterned their New World homestead after the laws and norms of Queen Elizabeth's England, including the enforcement of conformity to the Anglican Church. Parliament passed another Act of Uniformity in 1662, over 100 years after the first, which required acceptance of more revisions to the Book of Common Prayer and other religious observances to uphold public office. Virginia followed with its enforcement. Later, Parliament passed the Act of Toleration in 1689, which granted freedom of worship to Protestant non-Anglicans in England if they swore an oath of allegiance to the government. This legislation did not grant religious equality in England. It simply decriminalized the failure to conform to the Church of England's worship practices for Protestants. The dominance of the Anglican Church still made it difficult to be married or buried outside of its administration. The Act of Toleration permitted Protestant dissenters to conduct their own worship services if they registered the location, but it could not be a private home. It also required ministers to secure a license from the state to preach. While the Act of Toleration provided relief, it did not make nonconformists equivalent members of society. The Act of Toleration was only gradually applied in Virginia. Dissenting preachers often languished in jail for preaching without licenses. Early on, few religious dissenters lived in colonial Virginia, but the Great Awakening jolted the American colonies, swelling dissenter congregations and creating more instances of state oppression in Virginia. Dissenters soon drew the ire of the state. Baptists were especially targeted for their zeal and boldness, and their ministers' disregard for securing preaching licenses. Opponents would interrupt meetings and physically abuse the ministers until the local sheriff could arrive to perform arrest for illegal preaching. In 1778, aggressors attacked Baptist ministers David Barrow and Edward Mintz. In mockery of the ritual sacred to Baptist immersion baptism, the gang of abusers performed dunking or dipping, in which they forcefully submerged the ministers in river water. They would repeatedly raise the preacher out of the water again, asking if they believed, and then force them back again under the water. On other occasions, the ministers victimized in this way drowned to death. Opponents attacked another Baptist preacher, Samuel Harris, in the act of preaching in the county of Orange and dragged him away from the meeting by his hair. Sometimes opponents threw trash and stones at preachers as they addressed their congregations. These preachers were often arrested for disturbing the peace. Preachers were not the only targets of attack. Horsemen would sometimes ride into meetings to cause disruption, and in one instance tossed a hornet's nest into a prayer meeting, and in another a snake. These dissenters likely lived in constant fear of abuse, to say the least. It caused a negative perception of the established church among the dissenters. This was reinforced by the failure of the magistrates to discipline the persecutors. When Jefferson proposed his bill for establishing religious freedom, Thomas Jefferson meant to overturn for the dissenters in Virginia their disabilities, as they were called. But the strength of the Anglican Church prevented the bill from receiving serious consideration. Then the American colonies ignited with war, and the importance of the dissenters in Virginia increased.
Pond 5.
Virginia led out in the American independence movement, declaring separation even before the Continental Congress. As an early leader, the stakes were high for Virginia, and it needed men who would fight for its defense against the British superpower. These changes made the General Assembly more receptive to dissenters' requests for religious permissions. In 1775, Patrick Henry, in response to Baptist petitions, proposed that dissenting ministers be placed on equal footing in the army. The General Assembly approved. In the same sweep as its Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Assembly moved to create a new government with the Declaration of Rights. George Mason, as the foremost legal scholar of the Assembly, naturally assumed leadership of the drafting committee. With regards to religion, he articulated its current legal state in Virginia, declaring that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration. A young James Madison proposed an amendment that deleted Mason's fullest toleration phrase and replaced it with the promise of free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. In the same amendment proposal, Madison tried to disestablish the Anglican Church with the line, "No man or class of men ought to, on account of religion, be invested with peculiar emoluments or privileges." But the Assembly rejected this portion of his amendment. Members of the ruling elite were too closely tied to the power of the established church to undo it. The Virginia Declaration of Rights passed with the protection of free exercise of religion.
Pond 5.
American victory at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781 persuaded Parliament to cease fighting the costly and unpopular war. Yet peace did not end Virginia's pains. Slaves fleeing to the British Army in response to the promise of freedom reduced the state labor force. This disruption, coupled with burned fields and loss of trade, led to economic instability. The bankrupt legislature could not enforce the collection of taxes. Sheriffs and other public officials normally charged with collection profited from inflation and pocketed sorely needed revenue, but failing to enforce collection. George Mason believed the legislators corrupted and depraved the morals of the people. Anxiety about the decline in public morals during this period of unrest was intense and widespread. Newspapers published jeremiads concerned with the degeneracy of the times, and private correspondence included grief about the decline of morals. Most Virginian revolutionaries fostered the traditional belief that religion propped up virtue or public morality in society, which was imperative for preserving their new republic. Both George Washington and Patrick Henry believed this. Both these leading statesmen believed that individuals could still freely choose their religious expression while the government encouraged broad religious values. George Washington, Patrick Henry, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson each defended religious liberty, but they parted ways on the role of government in religion. While both Washington and Henry held the traditional 18th century view of government support for religion, to Madison and Jefferson, any state requirement with regards to religion violated the inherent right of conscience. In order to protect this right, the state and the church must be separate, they believed. This was revolutionary. These views would publicly conflict in the legislative battle of the General Assessment Bill. The fall of 1784 legislative session addressed the issue of religion in Virginia. The war left many Anglican parishes in ruin, and citizens were concerned about public morality. Several petitions came before the legislative body requesting a general assessment, meaning a tax collected for the support of religions beyond the established church. Citizens would choose which church received their tax. This was different from refunding the established Anglican Church, renamed the Protestant Episcopal Church at the close of the war. Several petitions in favor of the general assessment argued that religion benefited the whole community, therefore all should be required to sustain it. An Amelia County petition argued that state support for religion operated on the principles of public utility, and government survival relied on it. The delegates referred these petitions and others to the Committee for Religion and soon addressed it in the Committee of the Whole. A general assessment bill was proposed. For Patrick Henry and the General Assessment's many supporters, this multi-denominational approach to to promoting virtue in society honored both the public importance of religion and the realities of Christian pluralism in the state. The general assessment gained momentum. James Madison took to the floor of the speech advocating the delay of the bill's third reading. Such an important measure must first be taken to the people for consideration, he argued. He outlined the complicated nature of the legislature's task to determine which sects were Christian, and therefore who would receive the tax revenue received for Christian teachers. Which translation of the Bible would they use? The various sects disagreed on basic points of doctrine and scripture. Did the legislature believe it could quell these controversies? He notes that the true remedy for their post-war ills is not to establish a church, but to enact laws that cherish virtue, administer justice, and educate youth. On Christmas Eve, the legislature voted to postpone the final reading of the bill until the following fall legislative session, which was in November 1785. It also voted to make prints of the bill for the people's consideration. Each member of the assembly received 12 for distribution. The prints included the bill's text and a list of the delegates' names indicating their vote for the assessment.
Pond 5.
The time between the closing of this session and the opening of the next in November saw what historian Kevin Gutzman calls Virginia's first truly popular statewide political campaign. Petitions on both sides of the general assessment issue spread broadly. A colleague encouraged Madison to write his opposition to the bill. While among his books at Montpelier in June 1785, he crafted what would become the most brilliant discourse in religious liberty thought in American history, Memorial and Remonstrance. As it circulated among the people, Madison purposefully remained anonymous as its author. In it, Madison argued that because the right of conscience and its duty to God predate entrance into civil society, the legislature could not justly make laws dictating its expression, and society could not rightly impose a dominant religion on all citizens. It is true, the majority may trespass on the rights of the minority, but it offended God, said Madison. Government's proper role in religion was to be the guardians of the rights of the people and intercede at the invasion of those rights. This redesigned the church-state relationship that Patrick Henry and so many of the other revolutionary generation embraced. Rather than actively promoting religion, the government's role, Madison and Jefferson believed, was to protect individuals in their expression of their religious liberties. Anything beyond that violated inherent rights and was an offense to God. George Mason printed the anonymous memorial and circulated it in Virginia's Northern Neck, even sending a copy to George Washington with an accompanying letter. Copies circulated through the central Piedmont and Shenandoah Valley. Madison was pleased with its eventual momentum. However, though Memorial and Remonstrance gained a significant amount of subscribers, its reasoned tones acquired only 1/5 of the 10,929 signatories to the petitions opposing the general assessment. 90 petitions in opposition to the general assessment poured into the Assembly in the fall of 1785. Only 11 petitions supporting the general assessment came in. One particular petition carried 4,899 signatures. Madison's memorial gained influence as he revealed his authorship later in his life and as he transformed into the icon of the father of the Constitution. The editors of his papers write, "With the passing of time, history tended to forget the other protest of 1785 through 1786 and focused on Madison's. The Revolutionary War had ushered in social change in Virginia. Prior to the war, small farmers rarely made demands of the gentry, but wartime hardships produced egalitarian thinking that emboldened small farmers to pressure the elite for the improvement of their circumstances. This first truly popular statewide political campaign demonstrated a change in which citizens advocated for the protection of their rights. in this case, the freedom of conscience. The mobilization of these dissenters defeated the general assessment. Madison saw the opportunity and resurrected Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom, now 7 years old, and ushered it through the General Assembly to passage. Jefferson learned of its approval while serving as ambassador to France. Both politicians and petitions brought about the legal protection of religious liberty in Virginia.
Pond 5.
Madison's work to defeat Patrick Henry's General Assessment Bill was not antagonistic toward religion. He believed that removing government prescription in religious matters protected the inherent rights of individuals to express their religion as they chose. This expression without punishment would spawn a robust religious environment in which genuine competition would generate better religious teachers. This climate of vigorous competition with better teachers would then produce the virtue necessary to sustain a republic. Therefore, both Patrick Henry and James Madison fought for religious liberty, but Madison's innovation of removing government involvement in religion, a concept Jefferson espoused as well, parted from Henry's traditional belief of the necessity of government to prop up religion. It's true that Pennsylvania and Rhode Island from their beginnings boasted government structures that supported plural religions, showing society could be stable without forced conformity. But Virginia was more influential for the broader American Union. It was the strongest of all the established churches in the United States because of its close ties to the crown. Virginia's land claims and population size far exceeded the rest of the states. Many of the states patterned their rights declarations after Virginia's, and many of the top-tier American revolutionaries came from Virginia, such as Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and most especially George Washington. Revolutionary Virginia led the infant United States, and disestablishment signaled a redirection. To fulfill his campaign promise for a seat in the first federal Congress, James Madison synthesized each of the state recommendations for a federal Bill of Rights. He authored what would become the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution. With regards to religion, he wrote, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom would provide the background for the meaning of the religious liberty clauses of the First Amendment. The federal government would not establish a religion, and the free exercise of religion would be legally protected. This was revolutionary. For more than 1,000 years in the Western world, the church was an arm of the government. That connection was severed in the United States federal government. Dissenters in Virginia redesigned the relationship between church and state. In a flood of petitions expressing religious liberty as an inherent right outside the realm of government stewardship, they generated the circumstances to institutionalize their interpretation of the freedom of conscience into Virginia law. This struggle in Virginia transformed the colonial view of full toleration of religion by the state into the free exercise of religion with no established church. Without these dissenters mobilizing to fight for their freedom, Virginia religious liberty norms would likely have taken on the form of the General Assessment, a state-sponsored, multi-denominational Christian establishment.